Hey everyone, we're going to be covering every single one of the Teen Titans comics and their adaptations, going through each era and my thoughts on them. Last round we looked at the first ever iteration of the Teen Titans and things didn't go so well, so let's see if the revival from the 1970s team can do a little better. Teen Titans never stayed down as a concept for very long in DC history after their founding. But this first revival was probably very important in preserving it as a thing until Marv Wolfman and George Perez took over next round. In 1976, just a few years after the original run was cancelled, the series was revived. And it's really amazing what a few years can do for a comic run and perhaps the larger company as a whole. With Marvel having led the way for much of the Silver Age, DC was pretty quick to catch up by the time we get to here in the Bronze Age. Content was getting darker and more sophisticated in both companies, and as characters like Batman started to go to new places, others like Teen Titans member Speedy fell into heroin addiction. Marking an extreme change in the tone some of these stories featuring Titans members were covering around this time and behind the scenes of the revival. And all of that is reflected quite nicely in the newer Titans books. Right out of the gate, the team is made more diverse, pushing back against resistance the old guard of DC editors had placed on the original series. The first couple of issues following the revival are quite fun as we get into stuff like this, but what's really interesting about it is it's pretty mild in its storytelling, so much so that it truly boggles the mind that anyone would object enough to the older stories, so much so that they censored it to begin with. Unfortunately, though, these books are on the whole smarter and better put together than the ones from the original lineup, exploring new territory and content the original series could only dream of, the revival still feels pretty consistently mild and underwhelming. Though there are moments and fun bits, especially early on, that reflect a more serious and interesting tone in the original Teen Titans, it's nothing all that memorable or important in the larger scheme of this team's history. The biggest problem with the revival series, to me, is the Joker's daughter. She joins the Titans in a couple of issues into the revival and largely dominates the rest of the series as an allegedly fun new member that takes an awful lot of focus, all while draining the series of all the momentum and energy produced by the initial issues of the revival. Though the rest of the Teen Titans seem unsure about her at first, Duella Dent quickly wins them over and becomes a trusted figure and a core part of the team. We learn over the course of the run that she's actually the daughter of not the Joker, but Two-Face, and after a confrontation with the latter, she takes on the name Harlequin and continues to appear in the rest of the series in this new role. The stories featuring the Joker's daughter don't feel all that great and drag this particular era down in terms of my overall grade, while the revival feels like a huge step in the right direction and does a lot of good work at finally allowing the Teen Titans to explore the more interesting ideas and most basic levels of diversity that the rest of the industry was eagerly delving into at this point deep in the Bronze Age. It is drowned out here by this focus on Duella. Don't get me wrong, the character and the comics featuring her aren't all that bad, they're just odd. Weirdly out of place with the rest of Teen Titans history, this character doesn't feel like a good fit from start to finish. It doesn't help matters that she crowds out all the other Titans, distracting us from better characters who are far more important than Duella Dent will ever be to Titans history. Looking over Teen Titans as a whole, I feel Duella is one of the worst examples when it comes to talking about who worked best as a Teen Titan. A rebooted version of this character would one day return to the world of DC during the New 52. But that character would never really be associated with the Teen Titans, instead moving over to the Suicide Squad franchise. And though I don't think I'll ever be a huge fan of the Joker's daughter, it does always feel like a silly idea to me. She does work better as a member of Task Force X than she ever did as a Titan. This is a lot of time and attention for me to be paying attention to one character in this review, but it reflects how much she dominates the revival itself, as I don't have nearly as much to talk about when it comes to other members in these stories. The characters are better and allowed to behave in ways that better resemble human beings in the revival compared to the original run, but this is never explored in detail and not quite fleshed out the way better iterations of Teen Titans would do in the future. That being said, I do feel across these first two reviews I have been a little hard on Volume 1 of the Teen Titans. There's a lot of things I like about these comics, including Dawn of Troy, in select issues where the Titans get to have a little more fun compared to the rest of the DC lineup with teams like Justice League and the such, and what they were doing at the time. Lilith is a decently fun character, somewhat undervalued across Titans history, who would come back in fun ways that feel like a natural continuation of this series. The revival features a number of artists that really add something to this era of Teen Titans as well. These books feel different and are a little bit easier to read compared to the original run, and even then, looking across these first two eras, they do work a lot better than some of the lesser Titans runs we'll be talking about in the future. Teen Titans history as a whole owes a lot to this first volume as well, including the revival run and even the comics that came before it. I like how Duncan also becomes the Guardian over the course of the revival, as well as the sheer number of major Titans names established not only in their team but also in their rogues gallery, with the Teen Titans facing major enemies like Dr. Light and Mad Mod early on, along with Bumblebee being introduced and the concept of Teen Titans West, hinting at the future of Beast Boy joining the team. There's a lot to like here and a lot that could work. I just wish it succeeded at that a little more often. A couple of stories explore ideas like race in American cities during the 1970s or the Vietnam War. That's interesting, and where the Titans of this era feel like they could work best and are most breaking new ground here. Unfortunately, all this stuff I mentioned for the last couple of minutes is largely content that focuses around individual issues, and they feel less like a description of the overall trend in the books themselves. Those books tend to give up on a lot of the more important ideas being explored here in the favor of more generic stories as time goes on, and that's only made worse by the Joker's daughter dominating a number of issues. As the revival goes on, I noticed a palpable dip in quality and creativity, to the extent that the revival, over time, started to resemble more and more of the original series and what I didn't like about those books. In short, it feels as though, to me, across both the original run and this revival series, the Teen Titans had still not found their identity. More casual fans of the Titans might find, looking back on the first volume, that the Teen Titans they know and love are very different and alien from the ones we see here. As all the fun traits and promising aspects of the revival quietly faded away, and once again we started to get the same kind of flat and shallow storytelling of the original era, it shouldn't really surprise anyone to learn that the revival, like its predecessor, was met yet again with cancellation. This time, however, it seems like patience was not on the table, as neither the fans nor DC seemed willing to give this series nearly the level of a prolonged chance as compared to the original run. Just 2 years and only 9 issues after the revival started, Teen Titans was once again cancelled. The ending is sadly pretty flat and tepid like much of the 1970s Teen Titans books. They silently part ways in the final book, destined to remain separate for a few more years, until they inevitably returned in the next era in the 1980s. Like much of the revival, there's something to this ending, but it isn't quite realized or thought through. This could have been a real opportunity for these big, long-lasting names to really start developing as characters. Dick Grayson, in particular, had been around since 1940 and hadn't really changed, so the idea of finally aging him up decades later certainly doesn't seem like a bad idea to me. I think the final nail in this coffin comes down to the idea that it really doesn't feel like we got that fresh breath of air we needed in terms of creators behind the scenes. Not a lot of people that worked on the original series came back for the revival, and instead Bob Rosakias took over, though it seems as though a few lessons were learned along the way. Though the artist occasionally offered a fresh perspective, it never really got anywhere, and if anything, the comic's art got as lifeless and stale as it had been in Volume 1. No matter how you cut it, it seems like nobody at DC could just quite figure out what to do with the Teen Titans prior to the 1980s. It would take other creators to truly realize the potential of this team, but just like last round, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Generally, something like a revival is a good time to revamp and take a strong look at what got you cancelled to begin with. The Teen Titans of the 1970s did that, but just barely. Enough that it can be meaningfully measured as being slightly better over the original series, and thus it gets a C instead of a C-. But yeah, it really doesn't come down to being all that significantly better, and on the whole, there are much better days ahead of this team's history. And much worse. It should be noted that these C grades generally reflect a lot of mediocrity in these books, but they aren't nearly as bad as some of the worst stuff I've read across this series, and we're going to be getting into much lower grades going forward. Following this, the Teen Titans would return only 2 years later, when two new creators, Marv Wolfman and George Perez, took over. We'll talk about how those books hold up against Titans history and whether or not they make the grade next time on Comic Island.